Laura West had never thought that her life would turn so suddenly from dusty archives and quiet museum halls to the heart of a conflict she had never imagined herself capable of enduring. For years, she had been buried in manuscripts, cataloging forgotten artifacts, tracing fragile pencil lines on maps that smelled of mildew and time, a historian whose world revolved around words and relics. When the letter arrived from a law office in Vermont, informing her that her late Aunt Margaret had left her the Victorian house in Ridgefield, she did not even read it twice, assuming at first that it was a mistake or some bureaucratic formality. Margaret had been eccentric, reclusive, the kind of relative whose existence became a family legend rather than a lived presence. But the inheritance was real, and within weeks Laura was standing on a narrow street, suitcase in hand, staring at the house that would change everything. It rose from the earth with an unsettling grace, its gables sharp against the sky, its porch sagging with the weight of decades, the paint peeling into pale strips like parchment. Neighbors slowed down as they passed, some with suspicion in their eyes, some with a mixture of pity and curiosity. The house had not been occupied for years, though it had never been abandoned in the legal sense. Margaret had maintained utilities until the very end, if only at the minimum level. Inside, Laura found rooms that smelled of dust and lavender, heavy curtains that shut out the daylight, and carved banisters that spoke of a craftsmanship nearly forgotten. For a historian, it was not simply a house. It was a living archive, a place where each nail and floorboard was a record of the century that had passed since its construction. She quickly realized, however, that to remain in this community meant walking into the shadow of the local homeowners association, an entity that had grown powerful in ways that no outsider could immediately grasp. From the first visit to the HOA office with its glass walls and sterile smiles, she felt herself being measured, weighed, and placed into a category of temporary or unsuitable. The president, Barbara Sterling, a woman with immaculate posture and eyes that seemed to pierce through every polite phrase, welcomed her with words that were more warning than greeting. "We expect harmony here, Ms. West, and we value stability above all else." Laura nodded, not yet understanding that these were not pleasantries but lines drawn in advance of a battle. The house itself demanded attention. Water pipes clanged like old machinery. Wallpaper had bubbled from dampness in the corners, and the attic was crowded with boxes of Margaret's notes, strange collections of photographs, invitations, and receipts that hinted at a life lived half in, a secret. To cover costs and to breathe some life into the silent rooms, Laura had the idea of opening the house to the public. It was October, the leaves turning into embers along the sidewalks, and she played into the whispers already circulating in the neighborhood, that the house was haunted, that strange lights had been seen behind the windows, that Margaret had practiced rituals no one dared describe aloud. Instead of dismissing those stories, Laura used them. She set up tours, framing them as cultural events rather than cheap thrills, mixing genuine historical anecdotes with theatrical shadows. The response was immediate. People from nearby towns arrived with excitement, some laughing nervously as they crossed the creaking threshold, others whispering as they explored hallways lined with portraits that watched them from dusty frames. Laura wore gloves, carried a lantern, and spoke in long, measured sentences that turned creaks into symbols and cracks into echoes of history. The tickets sold quickly. The proceeds, modest though they were, allowed her to repair a section of the roof and to bring back electricity to rooms that had been dark for years. For the first time, the house felt less like a relic waiting for demolition and more like a presence reclaiming its dignity. But in the same moment, the atmosphere of the neighborhood shifted. The laughter of visitors did not mix well with the silence of manicured lawns. Cars parked along the narrow street, headlights stretching across driveways where residents preferred perfection. Curtains twitched, doors closed a little faster when Laura walked past, and invitations that neighbors extended to one another never reached her. She sensed it, but tried to ignore it, convincing herself that history was never comfortable, that bringing the past into the present meant shaking something loose. She was not prepared, however, for the way the HOA would interpret her efforts, not as renewal, not as a contribution, but as a threat to order. Each evening, when the last visitor left and the house returned to its silence, Laura sat on the porch, notebook in hand, trying to sketch plans for restoration. Her thoughts wandered between dreams of preserving the architecture and the unease that lingered from the way Barbara Sterling's eyes had fixed on her during that first meeting. The house felt alive in a way that inspired her, but the air around it, the very street it stood on, seemed to harden with invisible rules. Something told her that this inheritance was not simply about a building, but about a fight for space, memory, and the right to define what it meant to belong. When the envelope appeared beneath her door, Laura did not notice it at first. It was late in the evening, after one of the tours, and she was too tired to pay attention to the pile of menus and flyers that the wind had pushed against the porch. She picked them up absent-mindedly, and only when she reached the kitchen did she realize that one of the envelopes was heavier, printed on official cream-colored paper, the kind that carried weight before a word was even read. Her name was spelled in block letters across the front, but no sender was listed. She opened it slowly, already sensing that it was not an invitation or a neighborly note. The first line made her stomach tighten. This property has been designated as abandoned and subject to temporary control under the authority of the Ridgefield Homeowners Association. She read the sentence 3 times, as if repetition could dissolve its absurdity. Abandoned. Temporary control. It was a declaration, not a request. The document continued in the same chillingly bureaucratic tone. Inspections had noted an absence of continuous residence, a pattern of irregular occupation, and external disturbances inconsistent with community guidelines. The signature at the bottom, Barbara Sterling's, was sharp and deliberate, a blade across the page. Laura sat at the kitchen table, the silence around her deepening into something oppressive. She was living in the house, working daily on its restoration, paying utilities, breathing in the dust of every corner, and yet in the eyes of the HOA, it was already a corpse. She went outside, the envelope trembling in her hand, and looked at the house as if it were a stranger. The gables rose in the dim streetlight, the windows reflected nothing, and the porch creaked under her weight. From across the street she noticed a neighbor pulling a curtain closed quickly, pretending not to watch. Another walked a dog but turned down the opposite direction as soon as he saw her. It struck her then that the decision had not come suddenly. Whispers and nods had preceded it, neighbors exchanging looks, Barbara building her case quietly while Laura busied herself with visitors and repairs. The haunted house narrative had given the HOA exactly what it needed. Proof, however fabricated, that this was not a home but a spectacle, an intrusion. The following morning she marched to the HOA office, the letter folded sharply in her pocket. The building was small but sterile, with glass doors and the faint smell of disinfectant. A receptionist with a fixed smile asked her to sign in, then directed her to a waiting area with soft chairs that made her feel like she was sinking into silence. After 20 minutes, Barbara appeared, wearing a blazer the color of wet stone, her expression unreadable. She led Laura into a conference room with no windows, only a long table and a set of chairs that looked deliberately uncomfortable. Barbara sat opposite her, folded her hands neatly, and asked, "How can we help you today, Ms. West?" Laura laid the letter on the table and pushed it forward. "You can start by explaining this." Barbara glanced at it briefly, then nodded as though it were routine paperwork. "Your property has been under review. Several residents filed concerns about its status. The board determined that it qualifies for a temporary designation. Abandoned?" Laura's voice cracked against the sterile air. "I live there. Every day. I maintain the house. I pay for the utilities. I've been making repairs. How can you possibly call it abandoned?" Barbara smiled faintly, the kind of smile that disguised rather than revealed. Abandonment in this context refers not only to physical absence but also to the nature of use, hosting irregular gatherings of non-residents, failure to demonstrate continuous occupancy patterns consistent with community norms, and the absence of certain external indicators all contributed to the designation. What indicators? Laura demanded. Lighting at consistent hours, evidence of family activity, engagement with neighbors, Barbara said smoothly. A house is not only a structure, Miss West, it is part of a community. When it deviates from those rhythms, concerns arise. Laura stared at her, realizing that the language was carefully chosen to appear objective while being impossible to fight. How could she prove evidence of family activity? How could anyone define community rhythms? It was a weapon made of smoke, and yet wielded with authority. "You have no right," Laura said quietly, but her voice shook with anger. "This house is mine. I live there. It was left to me legally. You can't erase that with a piece of paper." Barbara tilted her head, sympathetic only in performance. "No one is erasing your ownership. The designation simply allows the association to intervene until stability is restored. You may contest it, of course, but the process can be lengthy. Meanwhile, the board has a duty to ensure that the property does not attract unwanted activity. Laura thought of the visitors, of the laughter in the hallways, of the excitement that had filled the air for the first time in years. To her, it had been life returning. To the HOA, it was contamination. She stood abruptly, the chair legs scraping against the floor, and left the letter on the table. Barbara's eyes followed her to the door, calm and certain, as though the outcome had already been decided. Back at the house, Laura tried to shake off the encounter but found herself scanning every detail with new suspicion. The garbage bins placed neatly at the curb looked like props in an argument she did not know she was in. The faint footprints of children who had walked across the yard during a tour seemed suddenly incriminating. Even the silence of the house pressed against her, no longer sanctuary but evidence of the isolation they claimed. She pulled out bills, bank statements, anything that proved her presence, and spread them across the dining room table. The papers looked flimsy compared to the heavy cream-colored envelope she had carried from the office. That night, as she sat by the upstairs window, she saw a car slow down in front of the house, headlights lingering on the porch before moving on. A second car followed an hour later, doing the same. She wondered if they were neighbors, board members, or strangers gathering observations for the next report. The realization chilled her. The house was no longer only hers. It had become an object of surveillance, a contested ground where every light switch and every creak could be interpreted as proof of guilt. She gripped the edge of the windowsill until her knuckles whitened, promising herself she would not let them take it. But beneath the resolve lay the dread that the fight had already begun, and she had entered it without choice, with rules written by others, rules that seemed designed to make her lose. Laura spent the following days in a state of mounting unease, the letter from the association lying on her desk like a loaded weapon she could neither disarm nor ignore. She told herself that rational proof would be enough, that if she presented records and documents, the weight of facts would crush the flimsy accusations of abandonment. She gathered everything with a meticulousness born from her work as a historian: electric bills, water bills, grocery deliveries, contractor receipts, insurance renewals, even a stack of library late notices with her new address written clearly on the top. With a folder so thick it barely closed, she returned to the HOA office, walking into the sterile lobby with her shoulders squared, as if the mere presence of evidence would tilt the balance. But when Barbara's assistant ushered her into the same windowless conference room, she immediately sensed that the game was not one of facts, but of control. Barbara was already seated, this time accompanied by two board members she had not met before, men in their 60s with identical expressions of bland civility, the sort of faces that revealed nothing yet radiated judgment. Laura placed the folder on the table, slid it across, and explained in steady sentences that the designation of her house as abandoned was not only inaccurate, but absurd. She pointed to payment histories, highlighted her active residents, described repairs and plans for restoration, and at last looked up, expecting at least a flicker of acknowledgement. Instead, Barbara leafed through the papers slowly, her eyes narrowing not in recognition but in skepticism. "These documents show financial activity, certainly," Barbara said at last, "but they do not demonstrate the kind of consistent residential presence that our bylaws require." Laura blinked in disbelief. How can paying utilities and living in the house not be consistent residential presence? One of the men cleared his throat, his voice carrying the slow authority of someone used to speaking in closed rooms. "Community stability, Ms. West, depends on patterns of life that assure neighbors of reliability. What you have here are the traces of occupation, but the community has seen irregular traffic, unusual visitors, and inconsistent signs of domesticity. It is not the same." The second man added, "We have received multiple complaints, not just about the gatherings, but about the atmosphere surrounding your property. Residents have expressed concern that your activities, however well intended, invite disturbances." "Disturbances?" Laura repeated. "Those were tours. Cultural tours. People came, listened to history, walked through the house, and left. Nothing unlawful, nothing dangerous. How is that a disturbance?" Barbara folded her hands neatly, her tone softening only to make the words sharper. "The nature of the visitors is less important than the perception they create. Perception becomes reality in a neighborhood such as ours. When families feel uncomfortable walking past a house, when children hesitate to play nearby, when cars they do not recognize linger on the street, we must respond. Our duty is to the collective peace of the community." Laura felt the blood rise in her cheeks, anger mixing with the realization that the argument was a labyrinth with no exit. Facts were irrelevant. Everything rested on feelings, on whispers, on carefully curated fears. She leaned forward, her voice low but cutting. "So, perception matters more than truth. You would rather call a house abandoned because it unsettles you, even when the owner lives there and maintains it." Barbara's smile was thin. "It is not about what unsettles me. It is about the trust of the neighborhood, and that trust has been shaken." For a moment, Laura thought of storming out, but something held her in place, the recognition that leaving would only confirm their narrative of her as unstable, unsuited to the rhythms of their carefully controlled environment. She forced herself to sit back, to breathe, though her hands trembled in her lap. "I am not leaving the house," she said at last. "You can call it whatever you want, but it is mine, and I will not abandon it." The board members exchanged glances, and Barbara closed the folder with deliberate care, as though sealing a verdict. "You are, of course, entitled to your position, Ms. West, but I must warn you that the board has already initiated the process of securing the property under temporary management. Until the matter is resolved, certain measures may be implemented: fencing, monitoring, safety checks. These are standard procedures. I suggest you prepare yourself for adjustments." Laura left the office with her folder returned, but her confidence shredded, the words ringing in her ears like a sentence already handed down. Temporary management. Fencing, monitoring. They spoke of her home as though it were a failing patient being transferred to intensive care against the will of its guardian. As she walked back through the streets of Ridgefield, she noticed details she had overlooked before. Neighbors who stopped talking when she passed, lawns too immaculate to tolerate even a single footprint, mailboxes identical in color and shape, as if individuality itself had been legislated away. That evening, when she returned to the house, she found a slip of paper pinned beneath the door knocker. It was unsigned, written in block letters. "Stop the tours or lose the house." Her first instinct was to crumple it and throw it away, but she hesitated, recognizing that it was evidence, however crude, of the hostility gathering around her. She placed it between the pages of her notebook and sat in the dim light of the study, the shadows of Margaret's furniture stretching long against the walls. The house felt different now. Not simply old, not simply haunted by rumors, but under siege. Every creak sounded like an intruder, every flicker of light from the street like a watching eye. As the night deepened, Laura considered calling the police, but she already knew how it would unfold. An officer would arrive, glance at the paper, shrug, and say that unless there was direct threat or damage, there was little they could do. The HOA would frame it as paranoia, neighbors would shake their heads, and the paper would be dismissed as meaningless. Yet she could not dismiss it, because she understood that the note did not come from nowhere. It came from the very culture Barbara had cultivated, a culture where perception outweighed truth, where silence was complicity, and where the first cracks of resistance were swiftly covered with cement. Laura lay awake until dawn, her mind racing with fragments of strategies that dissolved as quickly as they formed. She thought of Margaret, of the strange notes and clippings in the attic, and wondered if her aunt had fought a similar battle in silence, preserving the house by sheer stubbornness until death freed the HOA to circle again. She thought of her own life before Ridgefield, of quiet museum halls and the safety of archives, and realized how far she had stepped from that world. Now she was part of a narrative she had not chosen. The woman accused of abandoning her home while living inside it, the outsider turned into a symbol of disorder, the historian forced into the role of defendant. And as the sun finally rose, painting the gables in pale light, she knew the first stage of the conflict had passed. What came next would not be letters or warnings, but action, and she had no certainty of how far they were willing to go. Laura had always believed that truth revealed itself in documents, that in the fragile folds of paper and the faded ink of signatures lay a kind of permanence no argument could erode. But as the fight with the HOA deepened, she realized that truth itself could be ignored if no one had the courage to defend it. She began spending long hours in the attic, sorting through Margaret's boxes not with the eye of a niece curious about family relics, but with the desperation of someone searching for a weapon. Among stacks of brittle receipts, outdated insurance slips, and yellowed photographs, she discovered a folder marked only with the initials M.W. inside were letters written on official Ridgefield stationery from the late 1990s, correspondence between Margaret and the then president of the HOA. The words were formal, but the meaning was clear. Margaret had petitioned for exemption from association oversight on the basis of the house's historical significance, and the petition had been granted under a clause rarely invoked. One letter bore the phrase, "Approved exclusion for cultural preservation purposes," stamped with an official seal. Laura held it in trembling hands, hardly daring to believe that she had found what she needed, something tangible that cut directly across Barbara's confident declarations. Her first impulse was to take the folder straight to the HOA office and throw it onto the desk like a gauntlet, but something stopped her, a voice that whispered caution. She remembered Barbara's deliberate calm, the way she had spoken of bylaws as though they were shields against accountability, and she realized that simply waving an old document would not be enough. They would call it outdated, claim the exemption had expired, or worse, accuse her of fabricating it. If she was to fight, she needed not only proof, but allies, people whose voices could not be so easily silenced. For the first time since inheriting the house, she stepped beyond its creaking porch and sought help in the town beyond Ridgefield's neat lawns. She found herself at the county archives, a squat building of stone and glass where clerks moved slowly among shelves that smelled of dust and ink. After explaining her situation in careful words to a clerk named Harold, a widower with kind eyes who seemed to take an immediate interest in her story, she was led into a back room where the association's filings were stored. Together, they unearthed records that confirmed what Margaret's letter suggested. The house had indeed been granted a form of exemption, recognized by the county as part of a preservation agreement. Harold frowned as he flipped through the papers, shaking his head. "They should know this," he muttered. "It's in the register." Unless... He trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid, but Laura understood, unless someone had chosen to ignore it, to bury it beneath layers of newer bylaws and silence. She copied the documents carefully, thanking Harold with more sincerity than she had shown anyone in weeks, and walked out of the archive with a folder that felt less like paper and more like a shield. Still, she hesitated. To bring these documents directly into confrontation was to declare war, and she sensed that Barbara was prepared for exactly that. Instead, Laura turned to someone she had avoided until now, a lawyer. Through Harold's recommendation, she met Evelyn Hart, a retired attorney who lived quietly on the edge of town. Evelyn had been a military lawyer before losing her husband years earlier, and though she no longer practiced actively, she agreed to listen. In the dim light of her kitchen over tea poured with a steady hand, Laura explained everything from the haunted tours to the abandonment notice. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her gaze sharp but not unkind. When Laura laid out the exemption papers, Evelyn's lips tightened into something between satisfaction and anger. "This is good," she said, tapping the document, "but it's not enough on its own. They'll claim the bylaws have changed, they'll argue it doesn't apply, they'll drag you through months of hearings while the house sits under their so-called temporary control. We need to prove intent, not just error. We need to show they knew and ignored it." The strategy shifted in Laura's mind from defense to exposure. No longer was she merely protecting her house. She was uncovering a deliberate effort to erase history in order to clear the way for something else. That suspicion deepened when Evelyn introduced her to another resident, a quiet architect named Thomas Hale, who had once served on the HOA's planning subcommittee. He was in his 50s, a widower with lines of exhaustion etched into his face, and though he spoke reluctantly, his words carried weight. "They've been circling your property for years," he admitted, "long before you inherited it. There's a redevelopment plan, unofficial but real. They want to homogenize this section, make it marketable. Old houses don't fit the picture. Your aunt kept them at bay with that exemption, but once she died, they saw their chance." When Laura showed him the folder, his eyes darkened. "I saw that agreement once, years ago. They know it exists. If they say otherwise, they're lying armed with Thomas's testimony and Evelyn's guidance." Laura began to see the shape of the battle. It was not about haunted tours or neighborly discomfort, not about lighting patterns or community rhythms, but about power and property, about an association that believed it could bend reality by controlling the narrative. For the first time since the nightmare began, Laura felt something stir inside her that was not fear, but determination. She would not simply defend the house, she would reveal the truth that had been buried. But just as hope began to flicker, the association made its next move. Returning home one evening, Laura found a notice taped to her front door in bold letters. "This property is scheduled for preliminary safety assessment. Authorized personnel may enter to inspect." She ripped it down, her hands shaking. But when she looked up, she saw a van idling at the end of the street, two men inside watching her with the blank patience of people who had no reason to hide. The message was clear. They were not waiting for her consent. The next day, she heard hammering outside and discovered stakes driven into her yard, small flags marking the perimeter as though her home had already been claimed. Neighbors stood at a distance, not intervening, their silence heavier than words. That night she gathered with Evelyn and Thomas, spreading the documents across Evelyn's table. Evelyn leaned over them like a general mapping a campaign. "This is the midpoint," she said, her voice low and deliberate. "They're escalating. You've got proof of exemption, proof of intent to ignore it, and witnesses who can attest to the truth. Now, We need to push back, not just defend. If we bring this to the county commission with enough support, they'll have to investigate. And if they investigate, Barbara and her allies won't be able to hide behind perception anymore. Laura felt the weight of the house pressing on her shoulders, not just as a structure of wood and stone, but as a legacy of defiance. She thought of Margaret, of the stubbornness that had kept the house standing against conformity for decades, and realized she was stepping into a role her aunt had left unfinished. The fear was still there. Fear of the men in the van, of the notices, of the cold civility in Barbara's voice, but beneath it was something stronger, a resolve that had grown from nights of silence and days of watching her home turned into an accusation. The midpoint had arrived and there was no going back. She would fight not only for her house but for the truth itself, even if it meant tearing through the polished facade of the association and exposing what lay beneath. The escalation came faster than Laura had imagined, and with it a level of pressure that made her wonder if the walls of the house themselves were conspiring to break her will. Barely a week after discovering the old exemption documents and securing Evelyn and Thomas as allies, the HOA delivered its counterstroke. This time it was not a cream-colored letter slipped under her door, but a packet hand-delivered by a man in a tailored suit who introduced himself simply as Mr. Klein, legal counsel for the board. He stood on her porch with the posture of someone used to winning, his eyes scanning the sagging roofline and peeling paint as if they were already evidence in a trial. "Miss West," he said, extending the packet, "you are hereby notified of an official complaint filed by the Ridgefield Homeowners Association. You are in violation of community restrictions regarding unauthorized commercial activity, failure to comply with residential standards, and obstruction of administrative procedures." The words were spoken with the detachment of someone reading a grocery list, but to Laura they landed like stones. She opened the packet after he left, hands trembling, and saw page after page of allegations phrased in precise legal language. The haunted tours were described as unauthorized commercial operations endangering community security. Her gatherings of visitors rebranded as unsanctioned events resulting in disruption of neighborhood peace. Her resistance to the abandonment. Designation characterized as deliberate obstruction of oversight authority. Each charge was accompanied by a demand for compliance and penalties that, if enforced, could amount to thousands of dollars. She felt her chest tighten as she read, the cold realization setting in that the HOA had shifted the battle from perception and intimidation into the arena of law, where time and money would dictate survival. Evelyn was blunt when Laura brought her the packet. "This is their strategy. They want to bury you in process, bleed you dry while they move forward with their redevelopment plan. But notice the pattern. None of this is criminal. It's all framed as civil violations, fines, compliance measures. They're keeping it in their court because they think you'll either fold or exhaust yourself fighting." Thomas, sitting across the table with his hands folded tightly, added, "It's how they operate. They pile accusations until you can't see straight, and then they offer a settlement. Give up the house quietly, and the pressure vanishes." Laura felt a flicker of rage stronger than fear. "They don't get to buy silence," she said, though the determination in her voice was undercut by the knowledge that she was one person against a machine. The next blow came not in court, but on the street. One morning she stepped outside to find the yard littered with small signs hammered into the ground, each bearing the HOA emblem and the words, "Pending review, unsafe premises." Overnight her home had been transformed into a spectacle of warning, a place neighbors now avoided by crossing to the far side of the street. The few who dared to meet her eye offered hurried nods of sympathy but did not stop to speak. It was as if the house itself had been placed under quarantine, the stigma more powerful than any document. The humiliation cut deeper than she expected, and for the first time she wondered if Margaret had felt this same isolation, living year after year with a community that had decided her presence was contamination. Yet Laura refused to retreat. With Evelyn's guidance, she filed a formal response to the complaint, attaching the exemption documents, the county records, and Thomas's testimony that the HOA had long been aware of the agreement. The response did not simply contest the charges. It accused the board of acting in bad faith, of deliberately ignoring legal precedent to pursue redevelopment interests. Evelyn warned her that the language was aggressive, but Laura insisted. "If they want to drag me into the open, I won't whisper my defense. I'll shout it." The shouting, however, had consequences. The very next evening, while Laura was reviewing notes in the study, the power abruptly cut out. She rushed outside, heart pounding, and found 2 utility workers at the edge of the property, standing by an open electrical box. When she demanded an explanation, one of them, a man with tired eyes, said they had been dispatched on an HOA request for safety adjustments. Laura argued furiously until they retreated, leaving the power dead until she contacted the county. Herself. The outage lasted 2 days, and in that darkness she understood the association's tactics in their purest form. Not direct assault, but attrition, turning the daily rhythm of her life into a battlefield until exhaustion forced her to yield. But she did not yield. Instead, she documented everything. The signs, the outage, the visits by men in vans who parked across the street for hours without explanation. Evelyn helped her organize the evidence into a growing case file, while Thomas quietly reached out to a former colleague who confirmed the existence of redevelopment plans that conveniently left her house marked as target for reassignment. The proof was mounting, but with it so was the hostility. Neighbors who once waved politely now avoided her altogether, afraid perhaps of becoming collateral in a war they did not understand. The climax of the escalation arrived on a Saturday morning when Laura woke to the sound of hammering and discovered workers erecting a chain-link fence along the edge of her property. When she confronted the foreman, he handed her a clipboard bearing another HOA order, Temporary Containment for Community Safety, authorized under Bylaw 14B. The sight of the fence rising around her house, enclosing it like a cage, snapped something inside her. She called Evelyn, her voice shaking with fury, and within an hour Evelyn was at her side, waving the exemption documents in the faces of the workers and threatening immediate legal action. The workers hesitated, muttered into their radios, and eventually retreated, leaving behind half-finished sections of metal that gleamed like scars across the yard. As evening fell, Laura walked the perimeter, staring at the jagged fragments of the fence. The house loomed behind her, silent but alive, and she realized that every act of aggression, every fabricated complaint, every humiliating sign was designed not only to strip her of the property but to break her spirit, to make her surrender before the fight truly began. She stood there until darkness covered the street, the half-finished fence casting twisted shadows across the grass, and whispered into the night that she would not give them what they wanted. They could bury her in paper, surround her with metal, isolate her from every neighbor, but she would hold. Because the house was not only her inheritance, it was her stand, and she had crossed the line where retreat was no longer possible. The courtroom was not grand, not the marble hall of justice Laura had once imagined in stories, but a modest chamber lined with oak panels and fluorescent lights that hummed faintly above the rows of chairs. Yet for her it felt larger than any cathedral, for here the weight of months of struggle had finally condensed into a single confrontation. She sat at the petitioner's table beside Evelyn, who was calm and deliberate as always, her notes neatly arranged, her presence a shield against the creeping doubt that threatened to undo Laura each time she glanced toward the other side of the room. There, Barbara Sterling sat with her legal counsel, flanked by 2 board members, her face composed in a mask of authority, her posture radiating confidence as though the verdict had already been written in her favor. When the judge entered, the murmurs fell into silence, and Laura felt the air thicken with expectation. The proceedings began with the HOA's counsel, Mr. Klein, who spoke with practiced precision, painting a picture of a community destabilized by one resident's reckless disregard for order. He described Laura's tours as exploitative spectacles, spoke of complaints from neighbors about late-night disturbances, and repeated the word abandoned until it seemed to echo like a refrain. He gestured toward photographs of the house taken at night with its windows dark, as if the absence of light were proof of absence of life. To Laura, it felt surreal, as though her very existence in the house had been erased by the cadence of his words. Then Evelyn rose, and the tone shifted. She did not waste time on emotion, but placed document after document before the court, beginning with Margaret's exemption letter, moving to the county's register, and finally presenting the redevelopment plan Thomas had unearthed. Each piece landed with deliberate force, and when Evelyn called Thomas as a witness, his steady voice carried more weight than any argument. He testified that the board had been aware of the exemption for years, that he himself had seen it referenced in internal discussions, and that the redevelopment initiative targeted Laura's property specifically. "This was not neglect," he said firmly. "This was strategy." The words lingered in the room, heavier than any legal jargon. Barbara tried to counter, her lawyer insisting that bylaws had changed and that exemptions no longer applied, but under cross-examination, Evelyn dismantled the claim, pointing out that the association could not retroactively strip rights granted by official agreement without due process. The judge leaned forward, asking sharp questions that revealed cracks in the HOA's defense. At one point, Barbara herself took the stand, her answers polished at first but faltering when Evelyn presented the series of warning signs placed in Laura's yard. If the property was truly abandoned, Evelyn pressed, who exactly were these warnings meant to deter? An empty house cannot disturb neighbors. An empty house does not need containment. These measures were not about abandonment. They were about pressure. Barbara's composure wavered, her smile tightening until it looked less like confidence and more like strain. Laura listened, her heart pounding as though each word were hammering against the walls of the house itself. She thought of the sleepless nights, the men in vans, the half-built fence, the humiliating notices that had marked her home like a scarlet letter, and she realized that this was the moment where all of it coalesced into something visible. She had not been silenced, she had not been erased, and for the first time the truth was not hidden in boxes or whispered in kitchens, but laid bare in a forum where it could not be so easily dismissed. When the judge finally spoke, the words seemed to stretch across the room like a line drawn in stone. The abandonment designation was declared invalid, the exemption recognized as binding, and the association's actions characterized as exceeding their authority and engaging in coercive practices inconsistent with community governance. The pending complaint against Laura was dismissed with prejudice, and the HOA was ordered to remove all warnings and restrictions immediately. Moreover, the judge referred the matter to the county commission for further investigation, noting the evidence of redevelopment motives as a matter requiring oversight. Laura sat frozen for a moment, unable to process the victory. Evelyn placed a hand on her arm, a rare gesture of warmth, and whispered, "It's over, at least this part." Across the room, Barbara remained still, her expression unreadable, but the stiffness of her shoulders betrayed the fracture in her authority. For months, Laura had been treated as if she were the one who did not belong, the one whose presence was an intrusion. But now the balance had shifted. The association's power was not absolute, and the courtroom had reminded them of limits they thought could be ignored. As Laura walked out of the courthouse into the pale afternoon light, the world seemed both unchanged and entirely new. The house still waited for her, worn and imperfect, but no longer shadowed by the threat of being declared lifeless. She felt the weight lift, replaced not with relief, but with resolve. For she knew Barbara and her allies would not vanish so easily. Yet, for the first time since inheriting Margaret's home, Laura allowed herself to breathe, to believe that the fight had meaning beyond survival, that truth could pierce through perception when carried into the light. When Laura returned to the house after the verdict, the street felt strangely altered, though the trees swayed in the same wind and the paint still flaked from the gables. The warning signs were gone, the half-finished fence dismantled, and the van that had so often lingered at the corner was nowhere to be seen. Yet the silence that greeted her was not hostile anymore. It was watchful, almost uncertain, as though the neighborhood itself was waiting to see what would happen next. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar mix of dust and wood polish, and for the first time in months she did not feel like an intruder in her own home. The rooms were still scarred by neglect and battle, but they were hers without question, and the knowledge that the court had recognized her right to them settled over her like a fragile but undeniable shield. In the weeks that followed, the HOA retreated into caution, its board members suddenly polite in ways that were more telling than open hostility. Barbara resigned under the pretense of personal reasons, though everyone knew the truth, and her allies grew quiet as the county commission announced a formal audit of the association's governance. Neighbors who had avoided Laura began to greet her again, not with warmth exactly, but with the tentative respect reserved for someone who had stood against power and endured. A few even knocked on her door to apologize for their silence, confessing that they had been afraid of fines or retaliation, and while Laura did not forget their absence when she had needed them most, she accepted their words with a grace that surprised even herself. The tours resumed, though she framed them differently now, no longer leaning on the haunted image that had fueled so much suspicion, but presenting them as living history, moments of preservation that tied the past to the present. Visitors returned, not in the same numbers, but enough to remind her that the house had a future as well as a past. Standing on the porch one evening, watching the last guest leave, Laura felt a quiet pride settle into her chest. She had not asked for this fight, but she had carried it, and in doing so she had protected more than walls and windows. She had safeguarded a legacy of resistance, a reminder that truth mattered even when buried, and that a single voice could outlast the weight of an entire institution. And as the night settled around the house, she whispered into the air, not for the neighbors or even for herself, but for Margaret, whose stubborn defiance had begun the story that Laura had finally brought to its rightful end.